Hello, fellow readers and booktubers. I'm going to call this post a book haul of biographies. However, I think maybe technically it's not a true book haul. These are not biographies that I recently acquired. These are biographies I've had for a while, some of them for a few years now. They've been on my TBR shelf, or shelves, for quite some time. Some of them I purchased at bookstores or used bookstores. Some of them were given to me by gifts, by people who very much know my tastes in reading, and they made wonderful choices. But for whatever reason, many of these biographies I just never got around to because other books kept getting in the way. So I was thinking, when I'm projecting ahead to the coming year, 2025, I might make that the year of the biographies. I'll still do my regular reading, my fiction and nonfiction and history and philosophy or theology, whatever. But I'm going to put special focus on these biographies because they look good. And some of them are these huge kind of doorstop size books. And I do like a good meaty biography that's going to pull me into the life of another person for an extended period of time. So I took these biographies off the shelves and I put them into three separate piles. There are biographies dealing with people from the ancient world, biographies dealing with people from the medieval world, and biographies dealing with people from the modern age. And by modern age, roughly everything from 1600 to the present. So let's begin with the ancient world. And first of all, of course, there is Julius Caesar, The Life of a Colossus by Goldsworthy. Caesar is one of these inexhaustible subjects. I've already read many biographies of Caesar. There's a lot of information out there, although not quite as much as you might think. Even the original sources, are interesting to read. I'm thinking of Plutarch and Suetonius. There are some sources written by people who actually knew Caesar, Cicero in particular. In some of his letters, he talks about Caesar. And then, of course, there's Caesar's own writings. They used to call them the commentaries. Those are often a little suspect. Caesar was a great self-promoter, but Caesar wrote the War in Gaul. That's pretty much him talking, and it's fascinating. But there is enough to put together a fairly hefty biography of Caesar, and many have. It's always going to include some conjecture. Goldsworthy is a magnificent historian, so whatever conjectures he might include in this biography of Caesar will be based on some pretty solid evidence or pretty solid insight into ancient Rome and the age of Caesar. So Caesar, I might start with him. Okay, and then, of course, if you're going to read about Caesar, try to find a biography of Mark Antony. There aren't many of these. Antony is, we know what he did and a little bit of what he was like. But again, when it comes to the ancient world, we don't always have quite the sources you might think. Plutarch did write a biography of Mark Antony. He does appear in the writings of others. And again, Cicero knew Mark Antony, so he gives us a pretty damning portrait of the man. But this biography by Paolo de Ruggiero, I think that's the name. The subtitle is A Plain, Blunt Man, which describes the Mark Antony that comes through in the original sources. But I thought it would be kind of interesting. As biographies go, though, it's quite thin. There's not a whole lot here, but it should be intriguing nonetheless. So leaving the ancient world behind, we now enter into the Middle Ages, and here's a biography of Gregory the Great. It's called In the Eye of the Storm. Gregory the Great was the first of the really influential medieval popes. And for those of you unfamiliar with that change from the ancient world into the Middle Ages, once the Roman Empire in the West collapses, the only institutional authority left was the Catholic Church. And the popes, which head the church, become these very powerful figures. And Gregory the Great was really the first of them. Not the first pope. There have been many popes before him, and there'll be many after him. But he's the first one to kind of put the papacy on this trajectory of power. And within a few centuries after the papacy of Gregory the Great, the popes become essentially monarchs. The papal monarchy emerges. So Gregory is very influential in that regard. And also, he paid a lot of attention to to maintaining Western civilization, which was in ruins when he came to power. A great patron of the arts and literature, and a very learned man himself, or about as learned as you could be at that time in history. This would have been the late 6th century. So Gregory the Great. And then this is an interesting book, The Merchant of Prato by Iris Origo. This is a story, let me get the name correct here. I was not familiar with this individual. He was a medieval merchant who lived probably in Venice, I'm guessing. Oh, of course, Prato, right? His name was Francisco di Marco Dattini, who left behind a considerable body of written works. He was a merchant, so he kept very detailed records of all the sales that he made and the purchases and the debts that he incurred, and also included little details about his own personal life. And when he died, before he died, he requested that all of his papers be preserved, and so they were. And it wasn't until, I believe, the 19th century that these papers were discovered in pretty good shape, and so they form a kind of interesting biography of a medieval merchant. Let's see, Dattini, he lived in the 14th century in Tuscany, mostly in Italy, and he traveled into France. But he was a very successful businessman. He had offices all over the Mediterranean. So this is a biography of not a king or a pope or an emperor. This is a biography of a merchant. And so it should give us an insight into what medieval life was like down on the ground, so to speak. He wasn't a serf or a peasant, but he wasn't one of the leaders of society, but just interesting individual. So I look forward to this. I was unaware of this until I saw it advertised in a sale catalog from the New York Review of Books. They're among their classics, so I'll be looking forward to this. And then we've got, towards the end of the Middle Ages, we get Joan of Arc, Jeanne d'Arc. Okay, and the author of this is Helen Castor. It's interesting. It's a biography of Joan of Arc, but it's referred to as a history. This is largely because Joan of Arc is a relatively unknown, but a very influential unknown. Her life and her death almost marks the end of the Middle Ages. She, of course, is the patron saint of France. She took part in the 100 Years' War, led the French to victory in the Battle of Orleans. And then, of course, she claimed to be receiving messages from God, from the heavens. God was speaking to her, saints were speaking to her, and because of this, even though she was a hero among the French, she was accused of and convicted of heresy and burned at the stake. A really interesting character. They have the legal proceedings as they took place, like it was almost as if there was a court stenographer. There were scribes who kept track of what was said, and this has been the basis of various plays. She's a very enigmatic figure, but I'll be looking forward to this. I'm pretty sure this is not a hagiography. This is not a devotional study of the life of Joan of Arc, because she is a saint in the Catholic Church. This is serious historical work to try to get to the very heart of things and get a better sense of who Joan of Arc was. This is quite a well-respected biography of Joan of Arc, so much so that I got the Folio Society treatment. I think some of you might. The Folio Society, these books put in these wonderful boxed editions. I really like them. I've got more of them than I really should have because they're a bit pricey, but they're always worth it. These are books that will last. That's not an advertisement. I don't get any kickback, but usually if a book is given the Folio treatment, it's a book that's worthy of the ages. Those might be around for a while. And then we get right to the very end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern age, and of course we get Shakespeare. There's been a lot written about Shakespeare. This often surprises people who think Shakespeare is this completely mysterious figure. Not that mysterious. I mean, there's a lot we don't know about him, but there's enough that we do know about him that we can build something of a biography. Although what we know for sure about him could probably fill maybe just 2 pages double-spaced. But we know a lot about his times. He was there during the Elizabethan age. He would have witnessed the changeover from the Tudor dynasty to the Stuart dynasty, which would have tremendous ramifications for the future of the kingdom. And this is written by Katherine Duncan-Jones. It's called Shakespeare, An Ungentle Life. It was published by Arden, which is the British publisher of all of Shakespeare's plays. So I'm very much looking forward to this. I've read other biographies of Shakespeare, and again, there's a lot of conjecture in there. It really tests the mettle of a good historian as to how he or she can support the conjectures. And Shakespeare is just endlessly fascinating, as are his plays, and it's sometimes hard to separate the man from the play. But I'm looking very, very much looking forward to this one. And that brings us into the modern age, as defined by historians, roughly from the 16th century to the present, although some historians are now arguing we're not in the modern age anymore, we're in something called the postmodern age. But with that in mind, there's a biography of Voltaire, the shining bright light, or the beacon of the Enlightenment, an incredibly interesting Frenchman, his humor. I've read some of his works, especially his various essays where he's attacking the church and he's attacking monarchy, and then of course his famous novel Candide. What's so interesting about Voltaire, he lived in the 18th century, but his humor translates very well. A lot of humor from centuries past doesn't come across quite the same, but Voltaire he had such a grasp of things. What we would see as a very, very modern grasp of things, and this very dry, cynical humor, and he is laugh out loud at times. And so I'm very much interested to know more about his life. I know some things about his life. As I said, he was the leading light of the French Enlightenment, along with Rousseau. He traveled widely throughout Europe. He was the darling in the court of many kings, and also the enemy of many kings. A very intriguing figure, so I'm looking forward to reading this Life of Voltaire. This was by Ian Davidson. I think this one is fairly recent. Let me just get a better sense here. When was this published? Yeah, 2010. Well, 15 years ago. But Voltaire. And then, coming back across the waters to the United States, here is a Life of James Madison by Noah Feldman. The Three Lives of James Madison, Genius, Partisan, and President. James Madison, a towering figure among the founding fathers. In many respects, the author of the Constitution. Of course, there was a lot of other input there, but Madison was the one who had the vision of a good government. What good government meant. He was a political genius of sorts. He had a keen understanding of history. He was friends with Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. He's there at the beginning of it all. And Madison, I think this will be a very interesting work. I've read some other biographies of Madison. This one is a bit more recent. Let's see what we've got on this one. Yeah, 2017. So not all the biographies on my TBR shelf are that old. Are old. Some of them are fairly recent. This one's fairly recent. And then let's go back to France. Napoleon. I've read a lot about Napoleon. You could easily fill a library with books about Napoleon as the military genius, as political genius, as the first great man of the West. That's how a lot of historians defined him, or the great man, one of the great men of history, whose very life altered events. A lot of truth to that, and of course, there's a lot here. This will take a while, almost 1,000 pages. This, I believe, is also quite recent. Yeah, 2014, about 10 years ago. The Life of Napoleon. And then I'm going to finish things off. I'm not going to get to the 20th century, but sticking with the 19th century, life of the famous scandalous French poet Rimbaud, Arthur Rimbaud. If you've ever read any of his poetries, you know what I mean by scandalous. Rimbaud had his impact on poetry is felt even to this day. I've even heard it said that Bob Dylan claimed that Rimbaud was one of his influences when he wrote his interesting lyrics to his songs, particularly the ones he wrote in the 60s, the more surrealistic things. But this is Arthur Rimbaud, as I understand it, quite a tragic life, but an interesting personality. So I'll be reading that. So those are my books for my year of biographies 2025. In the meantime, that's what I've got for you now. Be safe, keep reading, and have a good day. Bye-bye.